Now let's look at the key aspects of a project financing model. So this financing model will help. How do you value a project? What, based on your various assumptions, what do you think is the rate of return which the project might generate? So there are two phases involved in it. One, create the end-to-end model based on the assumptions. Probably go ahead up to the creation of the financial statements for the project, projected future financial statements for the project, including the profit and loss statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement. Use that information to arrive at the rate of return which the project might generate. That is the phase 1 of this assignment. And in the phase 2, we would be even more interested in doing a what if analysis, which is nothing but the sensitivity and the scenario analysis. By changing a few of our assumptions, we would be observing what kind of input it has on the outputs, which are more like your rate of returns or the futuristic cash flows, in what years the negative cash flows and positive cash flows might come out. All these things can very well be analyzed, especially when we are doing a end-to-end project financing model. Typically, again, just to give a basic theoretical aspect of any project financing model, most of the projects today have a SPV created. The sponsor is creating the SPV or SPE, special purpose entity or a special purpose vehicle, that will be taking care of going ahead with the project. So they get into various agreements with various parties. It's not the sponsor company that gets into an agreement. It's that special purpose vehicle, which means that company is created exclusively for the purpose of executing that project. Because these projects typically have a very long-term life, a 30-year or a 40-year kind of projects. This company is created exclusively to handle that project. And once that project is over, this company also gets closed down. So those kind of companies are called as special purpose vehicles or special purpose entities. This particular company will get into a concession agreement with the concession guarantor. Could be government or any other entity which is offering the project. So there will be some kind of concession agreement with that party. The same SPV approaches the lenders and gets into a facilities agreement with them, and it gets into agreement with the contractors to do the construction part, engineering, procurement and constructions contract. It could get in tie up with the operators to get into an operations contract, because typically the project might involve a simple project might be a kind of a BOT kind of a project where there is a build, operate and transfer. So for building the entire project, the SPV may get in tie up with an EPC contractor. For doing an operations of the project, probably with some kind of an operator, the tie up could very well happen. And even the people who are funding the project, either in the form of lending or as equity, there would be shareholders agreement and memorandum of association associated with. So typically the SPV will get into the responsibility of getting into all these kind of agreements with various entities to kickstart this particular long-term project. So just getting into the simple details of it. In the concession agreement, generally it is between the grantor, who could most of the cases will be a government authority, and the SPV. So the government typically gives the rights. Now in this agreement, what happens? The government transfers the rights to build, own, operate the project for a specific period of time. So SPV will now have the right to build that particular. So if I am talking about a metro rail project in a particular city, so the government, there is government and there is a private company called X. These two have got into a concession agreement, and based on that concession agreement, what comes out is the government grants the rights to the company X to build, own, operate this metro rail project for some T number of years. They will clearly, in the concession agreement, it is very clearly specified for how many years they can build, own, operate that particular project. And even this can highlight what are the various sources of revenue for both the parties, and also it also highlights the key performance indicators. Probably you have to complete the construction, let's say within 3 years, or some such kind of performance indicators and performance evaluation milestones will be there as a part of this agreement. And even the revenue deductions in case the deadlines are not met. Probably if I don't deliver the phase 1 of the project, let's say by 15th March 2015, for every 1 month delay we can be penalized some $1 million. Some such kind of an agreement could come out as a part of this concession agreement. So this is generally between the government and the special purpose vehicle. Similarly, there could be the EPC contract, which we have earlier discussed, the engineering, procurement and construction contract. So there would be a EPC contractor who would be majorly responsible for engineering, procuring the raw materials and doing the construction of that particular project, designing, procuring and constructing. So that particular party, which is a construction company, must be involved with the designing, building of the project during a specified period of time. And there could be a contract. The contract could deal with the pricing for the construction phase and even the delays. If at all there is a delay in the construction, what could be the damages that need to be paid to the SPV. And generally, if the construction company and the SPV are one and the same, these need to be there may not be very high stressing on this, but if these two are two different entities, then there could be a very serious terms and conditions getting into it. And of course, if there is not too much of a construction phase involved, generally we call those contracts as brownfield contracts. When I say greenfield contract or greenfield projects, there is a lot of construction phase involved in it. But when I deal with brownfield project, there is no construction phase involved. There could be directly the operations phase itself. So whenever we are talking about a brownfield project, probably I don't need too much of EPC contracts getting into it, whereas a greenfield project does require that. But of course, in some brownfield projects, especially when there is expansion and all, then probably EPC contract might still be required. Similarly, we can talk about operations contract, especially comes into picture during the operations phase of the project, because most of the time, if let's say 3 years is the construction period for a metro rail, the agreement might talk about 30 years of maintenance of the same or 30 years of operations for the same. So operations and maintenance, these two are taken care by the SPV itself during that period. That is mentioned as a part of the concession agreement only. So the SPV, it can actually have a subcontracting of that given to an operations contracting company, which will be responsible to operate and maintain the project, and even any kind of a capital expenditure replacements that are required in the middle. Probably let's say this is a 30 years of maintenance and some furniture has been present, and I am assuming that this furniture will become outdated and probably obsolete or probably damaged within 10 years. So it's the responsibility of the operations contract company to replenish this furniture also probably at the end of 10 years and at the end of 20 years, as long as this operations contract is in force. So it could even involve the day-to-day maintenance and the operations activities along with the replacement of the capital expenditure also. So for whatever the performance, the operator receives a pay either in the form of fixed or the payment terms and conditions can very well be set as a part of this operations contract. Even it could involve the key performance indicators for the same also. Then a similar kind of agreement could be created between SPV and the lenders. This talks more about the lending terms or the borrowing terms for the project company. Basically talking about the amount, the time intervals, or probably we call it as drawdown frequency, right? The time intervals during which the amount can be, the loan can be drawn, and what is the repayment profile, how many years the repayment is going to happen, is there any kind of moratorium period. We'll talk about each of these things, and what is the interest rate that is applicable, and if at all there are any kind of one-time upfront premium that needs to be paid, or any kind of reserve accounts that needs to be maintained. All these things are very clearly highlighted as a part of facilities agreement. So these, and even the positive and the negative covenants from the borrower's perspective, like what are the do's and don'ts from financial perspective, what are the responsibilities of the project company, like they have to maintain, they should not issue some additional shares without the knowledge of the lenders, or probably they have to maintain, they have to file their actual financial statements every year. So some such kind of do's and don'ts are expected by the lenders, and that are mentioned as a part of the facilities agreement itself. Similarly, there could be a shareholders agreement, especially if the funding is more in the form of equity, right? And in what way the dividends and all are paid to the shareholders is clearly identified as a part of this shareholder agreement. Even a MOA, Memorandum of Association, is also a kind of agreement between shareholders and the SPV. It talks very clearly in terms of how the shares are issued, how the board is appointed, what is the dividend policy, and what are the rights that are available to the shareholders in the decision making of the project. All these things are typically highlighted as a part of the MOA of the company. Now, when we are getting ahead in terms of building a financial model for this kind of a project, as I have highlighted earlier, you have to use the right combination of the spreadsheet rules and formulas to generate as much of dynamicness as possible. Generally, we talk about these 5 broad areas in any project financing model. We start with a clear-cut detailing out of the assumption sheet. Then we look into the entire construction process. We do some kind of estimating the cost during the construction process. Then we move on towards the operations. We also try to analyze the year-wise revenues and expenses associated with the project over the entire maintenance period of the project. And we also look at, and typically we see the construction related calculations and notes available from the EPC contract, the operations related stuff, I can get from the concession agreement because it highlights the revenues, and the operations costs can come from operations contract. Then looking at the financing part, probably a facilities agreement wherein the details of how to borrow, how much to borrow, the time periods of repayment, the interest rate, all those details can be obtained from the facilities agreement between the lender and the SPV, and even some of the things associated with the dividend payments and the contribution of the equities and all can come from MOA. Similarly, I am even going ahead looking at building the cash flows for the project, though the building of cash flows requires the building of balance sheet and the P&L statement, but I need to get into a clear cut detailing out of each of these 5 major ingredients of any project financing model. Now, what do we put as a part of each of these phases in the assumptions? As far as the assumptions are concerned, generally I look at 1 or 2 Excel sheets. If they are static assumptions, means one single number for the entire life of the project, we call them as static assumptions. Time series assumptions, every year different assumption. Let's say a revenue assumption. If I say 7% for the whole of 30 years, then I call it as static. Or probably I may say, okay, first year 1, 8%, year 2, 8.5%, year 3, 6.5%. If such kind of year wise changes or different numbers for different time periods are there, we call it as time series based assumption. Sometimes based on some kind of forecasting framework, I may try to arrive at those kind of percentages for different time frames. So assumptions wise, I may try to create either 1 or 2 Excel spreadsheets. The more complex your model is, the more the number of sheets you may have to use. So that can actually help us determine whether our financial model is a flop or not, because the more I play around with those numbers in the assumption sheet, if my outputs are not coming out proper, or if some kind of errors are coming out in the output, then my financial model has suffered some kind of a damage somewhere or the other. So that's one thing, and probably that assumption sheet makes his job easier for auditors as well as financiers, or probably any user of that model. Just change the numbers and look at the outputs. It can actually help all the users quite comfortably for doing some kind of cross checkings. All these things, and even from the perspective of risk analysis, sensitivity and the scenario analysis, the financial modeling becomes more and more robust if our assumption sheet is quite comfortably designed. And when it comes to the construction phase, as I have already highlighted earlier, it is more and more applicable to a greenfield projects or brownfield project with expansions only. So it's better to create a separate Excel sheet wherein we'll try to compute the cost of constructing each of the project, the project related administrative costs, if there are any kind of upfront costs for advisors and consultants, or any kind of financing costs. All these things go as a part of the construction phase. So it is basically an element to derive how much funding is required during the construction phase. Probably we use terms like IDC, interest during construction phase, and based on all these assumptions we'll try to arrive, the end output of this particular phase is identify how much funding is required for the entire project, how much is the total cost of the project, how much is funded in the form of debt and how much is funded in the form of equity. All this is derived as a part of the construction phase of the project. Then we are getting into the operations side, wherein I maintain a separate Excel sheet, one or more. One talking about, I definitely have to capture all the sources of revenues, wherein we may have some fixed payments, some variable payments, some changing year over year. All these things need to be captured. Similarly, operating expenses including the maintenance, staff, administration, all these things, and if at all there is some kind of a replacement of the capital expenditure, even those things need to be taken into consideration. And the impact of taxes, probably if I am able to work it out separately in a separate sheet, it could be much better. So again, the various types of taxes, probably how do I get into corporate, incorporating the corporate tax as well as the minimum alternate tax or dividend distribution tax into my model. All these things, those kind of calculations need to be taken care, and it should be robust enough to handle all these kind of scenarios. And if there are any working capital requirements, even those things need to be built as a part of the operations part of the sheet. And the cash flow that is available for debt service, sometimes we even talk about debt service reserve account, we'll talk about all these things. So all these things have to be incorporated very well into the financial model, and the reliability of the financial model will be very much dependent on the robustness of these various items in the model. Then getting into the next aspect, which is the financing aspect. So we are talking about the various funding related aspects, the debt, the cost of debt, and probably the duration of debt, the drawdown frequency, all these things. How am I able to compute the interest amount as well as the principal amount that need to be repaid each of the years? Similarly, the equity portion of it, how much of dividend I am paying, how much of return of the capital I am doing at the end of each of the periods. I need to have a proper logic and formula which will do these kind of situations. And construction phase, what is the kind of funding, how much is getting funded in each of the years of construction, and what is the repayment section. So we need to have clear cut identification of each of these sections. And finally, when it comes to the cash flow, this is what is the heart of the valuation of any financial entity. It could be a project, it could be a company, whatever it is. So this is the one that decides the worth of the underlying. So we take all the outputs from the construction phase, the operation sheet, the financing sheet. From the various sheets we take the inputs, and finally build the financial statements, so that we are able to identify the net cash flows that are coming out of each of the phases, which can help us in building good balance sheet, income statement, a summary sheet, probably which can talk about a single page summary or a snapshot regarding the entire project, and also dealing with the sensitivity and the scenario analysis for the project. So with that as the base, we will start off with our practical case study, which can help us to build a financial model end to end, and at the same time perform some kind of sensitivity and scenario analysis on the model once the model is being built. Alright, with that as the base, let's move further to our next session.